Welcome to General Equilibrium on NyQuil Part 5, the household. Again, last time we talked about how the firm operates. I showed you the production function for the firm. I also showed you the law of motion of capital, which is actually a flow equation which describes investment, because investment is like the net new capital less depreciation. So we went through all that. I showed you how to play around with it with a constraint where you have a constraint y equals c plus I that is now in terms of only capital and consumption. So now we've learned about how the household actually optimizes. So we went through all that stuff. You had your two-period utility function. I gave you your two-period constraints, showed you how to plug them into one another so that you had only one constraint, and you could go through and optimize, and you could derive the household's Euler equation. I showed you what the firm's production function looked like in the last lecture. And now that you've got all of that stuff, we can play with a very, very simple general equilibrium model. It's actually what's known as the neoclassical growth model. And it's kind of like the workhorse model for all dynamic general equilibrium models. And it's really not that different from the household optimization thing I showed you earlier. It's just now we've also endogenized output. So we've got households optimizing, just like you saw before. And then because of the way that the household is optimizing and because they're choosing their consumption savings path, namely their savings path, because they're choosing that, you're going to be able to see how the firm actually optimizes as well. And when we have both the household and the firm optimizing, right, this is happening simultaneously. When households and firms optimize, you get an equilibrium. Because the household optimizes, well, that's going to give you demand. The firm optimizes, that's going to give you supply. When you put demand and supply together, boom, you have equilibrium. So let's go back to what the household's problem was. Remember that they wanted to maximize their utility. So we've got a two-period utility function that is like a natural log form. So we've got the natural log of today's consumption plus beta times the natural log of future consumption. And remember, beta is the parameter of how patient you are, or really how much you value the next period relative to this period. So if beta is 0.99, the next period is 99% as valuable to you as this period is. But it's generally, doesn't have to be, but generally going to be less valuable than what today's is. Now, it can be equally as valuable, right? Beta could be equal to 1 if you wanted. But I don't know. We generally just assume that the future's a little bit less important. It's still very important. It's just not quite as important as today. So anyways, we have this utility function. So it's two-period utility function. It's log utility. And it's subject to a couple of constraints. The first one is the production function. The second one is the law of motion of capital. And the third is the resource constraint. And hey, look at me this time. I fixed the color coding problem. Go me. Yay! So equation 2 describes how the firm produces. Equation 3 describes the flow of capital or flow of available capital to the firm. And then what equation 4 does is it ties those together with consumption. So equation 4 is what's known as a resource constraint because it says that the use of outputs has to be equal to the source of the outputs. So left-hand side is the source of outputs. You can think of like the source of funds, right? And the right-hand side is the use of funds. So the source of funds has to be equal to the use of funds, right? Your income has to be equal to how much you spend each period. So if you're making $100, and we're assuming away credit cards here, but if you're making like $100 a month, then you can't spend more than $100 a month. So that's what the resource constraint is telling me. It's that no matter how much I make, I can't spend any more than that. So we went through this last time, but hey, practice makes perfect. Let's take y equals a times k to the alpha, plug it into y in the resource constraint, which gives me this. Right? So all I did was just switch out a times k to the alpha with y. So now I've got that equals the sum of consumption and investment. But remember, investment is that law of motion of capital, right? KT plus 1 minus delta times KT. So I'm going to take that, I'm going to plug it into I in the resource constraint, which gives me this right here. Now, this constraint in this form, well, almost exactly this form, is pretty much ready to go. There's one additional thing I'm going to do. All right, so we've got this guy here. This is the new constraint that's used in the household's optimization. Like I said earlier, it's taking this constraint, right, because we got y equals c plus I. We got a lot of variables in there. We got consumption, which, is an input of the utility function, so at least there's that part. But then we got y, and we've got I. Well, if we endogenize output, right, output's a function of capital, well, that, puts it in terms of y, or puts y in terms of k. But then we've got investment, which is what determines, one of the things that determines production, also in terms of k. So I've switched out y and I with just k. So now I've got k and c in this equation. So this right here is going to be the constraint on the household's optimization. They're going to want to maximize their utility subject to this constraint right here, which says the source of funds has to be equal to the use of funds. So this is still saying output, which is income, can't be exceeded by the sum of consumption and savings, which is now investment. So we've endogenized output, meaning that when the household's optimizing, they're choosing their consumption path, which determines the capital accumulation choices available to the firm. And because of this, right, because the household is choosing consumption and sort of by default, they're also choosing capital, thus savings or investment, right? They're choosing how much they want to consume. They're choosing how much they want to invest. The more they invest, the more the firms can produce, but they can't consume as much today because, well, they're spending more on investment goods than they are consumer goods. So if they spend more on investment goods, they don't get to consume as much today, but the firm gets to produce more tomorrow, which means there's more available for consumption tomorrow. So, like I said, the constraint was almost ready to go. There's one little tiny thing I need to do. I want to solve that constraint for C, and then I'm going to plug it into CT in the utility function. Now, I also have to update the constraint for one period, because not only am I optimizing over CT, I'm also doing it over CT plus 1. But remember, if I were to update this one period, right, I'm just going to add 1 to every T subscript that I see, but there's no KT plus 2 because the world is over in T plus 2. So there's no point in saving if the world's going to end, right? If there's, let's think like Deep Impact or Seeking a Friend for the End of the World or that awful Leonardo DiCaprio movie. Don't Look Up, I think that's what it's called. God-awful movie. Anyways, think about any of these movies, right? These disaster movies. There's a giant asteroid headed towards Earth. Oh, no, we're all going to die, right? Okay, terrible. But if we're all going to die, are you going to save anything? No. Why would you? Because an asteroid's going to hit the Earth. It's going to completely obliterate the world. There is no point in saving for a future that's not going to exist. So there's not going to be any KT plus 2 because there is no T plus 2. So when I update the constraint one period, KT plus 2 just becomes 0. Right? And then I'm going to take that, I'm going to plug it into CT plus 1 in the utility function. And then I'm going to differentiate it with respect to KT plus 1. Why am I doing that? Well, KT was chosen yesterday, and KT plus 1 can be chosen today. So once I differentiate it, I'm setting the derivative equal to 0. I'm going to plug CT and CT plus 1 back in, solve it for CT. So the steps really back here aren't all that different from what we did with the household's optimization. It's just now we're optimizing over some slightly different things. So we've got our utility. And I've got the current period constraint, which is C equals A times K to the alpha, right? It's production, Y, minus I. So if you take the resource constraint, Y equals C plus I, right? You want to solve it for C, you just subtract I from both sides, right? Cool. Well, that's what I did here. I've got Y minus I. This guy right here is Y, this is output, and this guy right here is I, this is investment. So output minus investment is what you're consuming. So that's the current period constraint. And the future period constraint is going to be this guy right here. Notice there's no KT plus 2 because, well, we're not doing anything in T plus 2. So I got CT plus 1 equals output tomorrow plus 1 minus delta times KT plus 1. So this is the amount of available capital less depreciation. Right, and so I'm going to plug the first guy, equation 9, I'm going to plug that in for C in the utility function. And equation 10, I'm going to plug into CT plus 1 in the utility function, which gives me this right here. And you're probably cursing me going, Jeremy, what in the hell is this? Well, before you freak out, because I know there's like a lot of letters and there's really not any numbers. And there's what, 2 numbers? 3, 4, 5 numbers, 6, whatever. However many numbers there are, I don't know. However many numbers there are, I'm too lazy to count. Don't worry about it. Just think about what this is intuitively telling you, right? The natural log of consumption today, it's just now consumption is equal to output minus investment, but that's still consumption, right? This thing in the pink or the magenta, as LaTeX calls it, right? This is still just consumption. This is CT. This is CT plus 1. It's just written funny. It's just a different way of saying it. And I'm differentiating across the utility function, the whole thing, with respect to KT plus 1. So the first derivative with respect to KT plus 1 is this guy right here. All right. Well, how and why did I do this? Well, remember we got the chain rule, right? Derivative of the outside times the inside times the derivative of the inside. So I got the derivative of the outside, right, times the derivative of the inside. Because remember, KT plus 1 is negative. So the derivative of negative KT plus 1 with respect to KT plus 1 is just going to be negative 1. So I get 1 over all this stuff, right? This is the inside. Well, with the inside, remember, that is, what is that? That's just CT, right? That didn't change because remember, it's just 1 over the inside. Well, the inside was CT, so it's 1 over CT times negative 1 plus beta times 1 over all this blue stuff. Well, what is this blue stuff? This is CT plus 1. And remember, all right, 1 over CT plus 1, if CT plus 1 is equal to this, well, all this blue stuff is still just CT plus 1. But now the interesting part is what's going on in here. What is this? Well, let's take a look. I showed you in the last lecture what the marginal product of capital was. That's what this is right here. So with the marginal product of capital, alpha times A times K to the alpha minus 1 plus 1 minus delta. Why am I adding 1 minus delta? Well, aside from the fact that it's attached to KT plus 1, so you have to differentiate it, and that's, what the derivative is. All right, what else is it? Think about it in terms of the depreciation. It's the marginal product of capital less depreciation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to substitute CT back in for this magenta denominator and CT plus 1 in for this blue denominator. When I sub those back in, this is what I get. I get 1 over CT times negative 1 plus beta times 1 over CT plus 1 times the marginal product of capital less depreciation. Now, I'm maximizing this. This is my utility function still, right? So I'm maximizing it with respect to KT plus 1. And because I am maximizing it, I have to set it equal to 0. So this is what you get and set it equal to 0. Now I'm going to move 1 over CT over to the other side. So now I get 1 over CT equals beta times 1 over CT plus 1 times the marginal product of capital less depreciation. This is the Euler equation. And you're probably going like, yo, wait a minute. What the hell? You lied to me. Well, okay, maybe I told you it was always going to be this right here. But it is. It's still that. So if, you want to get upset, don't get upset because there's no reason to get upset. 1 plus R, 1 plus the interest rate, is equal to 1 plus the marginal product of capital less depreciation. All right, so alpha times A sub t plus 1 times K sub t plus 1 to the alpha minus 1 plus 1 minus delta is the marginal product of capital less depreciation. So if I want to jump to it, that whole thing, right, the marginal product of capital less depreciation is equal to 1 plus the interest rate. So why is that? Well, it's pretty simple, right? This is the marginal product of capital less depreciation. It's telling you how much additional output you will get from 1 unit of capital, but it's also controlling for the depreciation rate on the capital. So if the capital depreciates a lot, right, you add 1 more unit of capital, it's not all going to new production. A lot of it's going to fixing and replacing old capital that's fallen apart. So the more capital depreciates, the more you have to invest in order to be able to just maintain the existing capital stock. And as such, if you get more depreciation, the real return on investment is going to be a bit less. Why? Because, well, you're replacing a bunch of stuff that was already there. You're not growing. There's nothing new being made. You're just replacing existing stuff. So if you're to invest 1 unit of your capital today, then tomorrow you'd get what you invested plus R times what you invested, right? So, we've gone through this before. If you invest $100 today at 5% interest rate, tomorrow you're going to get $105. All right, so in equilibrium, the marginal product of capital is equal to the real interest rate. The real interest rate is the rental rate of capital. So you see, I didn't lie to you. It's just another way of writing it. But if you go through the formulation in this particular lecture, right, there's no R in there, right? There's capital, there's depreciation, but there's no real interest rate. So now that we've gotten our Euler equation, all we really need to do in terms of the calculus is taken care of. So what we're going to want to do is list out all the equations in the system, because each equation here is going to be describing some part of the market. When we include all these little individual parts of the market, we have what's known as a general equilibrium. When they're all included, we have closed out the system. Why is it closed? Well, it's closed because there's nothing from the outside. No door is left open for new stuff to come in. Everything is closed in the sense that there's no new stuff that can come in because we've controlled for it, right? You don't want new stuff getting into your house. What do? You close all the windows. So that's what we're doing with this general equilibrium. So what we're going to do is first we're going to want to list them all out. And then once we've listed them all out, we can talk about some steady states. The steady states are for another lecture, but I do want to say that in the steady state, all the endogenous variables are growing at like the same rate. So today's consumption is equal to tomorrow's consumption. Capital today is equal to what capital will be tomorrow. Of course, less depreciation, is we got to make sure that we are maintaining the capital stock. And because consumption and investment will both be constant, output will also be constant over time. So if y equals c plus I, and c and I are constant over time, y is also constant over time. And that's what the steady state stuff is going to be telling us. But let's get back to some other stuff here. Remember, when we all took algebra, right, we had to deal with systems of equations. You remember that? And you had to solve for multiple variables. And you always needed as many equations as you had variables, or else the system is under-identified and you couldn't uniquely solve for every variable. Well, the same thing is holding here, right? We're concerned about our endogenous variables, and we want to have as many equations as we have endogenous variables. Otherwise, we won't have a unique equilibrium. So what are the endogenous variables? We got output, we got capital, we have consumption, and investment. So it means we need at least 4 equations to describe our system. Now, our exogenous variables, right, we've got our endogenous variables, output, capital, consumption, and investment. Our exogenous variables, however, are A, our total factor productivity, alpha, delta, and rho. Remember, alpha is capital's share of labor, or capital's share of income. Delta is the rate of depreciation, and rho is a measure of how impatient you are. Now, alpha, delta, and rho are all time invariant. A, on the other hand, is time variant. Why is that? Well, A is a source of shocks. Shocks don't enter the system through alpha, delta, or rho, but they do enter the system through A. So remember, A is a source of technology shocks. If Elon Musk invents something new, right? SpaceX comes up with cool new stuff, that's going to be an increase in A. If Al Gore invents the internet, well, okay, that's an increase in A. So because we have an increase in A, or it could be a decrease, it can change over time. Because it can change over time, we've got a T subscript there. So let's list off all of our equations. All right, I got equation 16. I got equation 17. I got equation 18, equation 19, and then I got equation 20. Now, equation 16 has an error in it. The error is I kind of forgot to take care of depreciation in that. So the PDF notes will be fixed on that. So please, please, please refer to the PDF notes for equation 16 because there is definitely an error in that. So equation 16 is the Euler equation. 17 is the resource constraint. 18 is the law of motion of capital. 19 is the aggregate production function. And then 20, what's in the pink there, that is a process by which technology shocks are governed. So we're going to end here for now. Next, we're going to talk about steady states and how they matter for this stuff and why they matter, right? Why are we going to care about what these things are doing? Well, I guess without giving too terribly much away, if we want to see what's happening with these guys, we're going to have the equilibrium within the market, but we also want an equilibrium across time. So we want to see what these guys are doing when they're at rest, because that's going to tell us what happens if we change one of these variables. So we can think of like the long run behavior, right? There's what you're doing now versus what your long run trajectory is. So if we think about the long run trajectory, right, what these guys are all sort of like tending towards, right, we can think about how it drives the long run behavior of other variables. And that is also going to help us kind of parse out what some of the short run behavior is versus the long run. We need steady states for all that good stuff. So the next lecture, we'll have steady states, and we'll also have that error fixed with the Euler equation. So refer to the older Euler equation with the depreciation included with the marginal product of capital, because that is actually the correct way to represent that equation. So anyways, thank you for watching this particular lecture. There will be some more coming out very soon where we talk about steady states. And thank you for watching.